All right. Well, we spent a lot of time, probably more time than we will on any other issue, talking about abortion. But we have two other issues that are related to the beginning of life. The first one has to do with reproductive technology. And before we get into this, I do want to make one final word on, I guess we'll talk about this more with some other ethical issues, but we've got to be careful when we talk about the Christian ethical standard for all of these things, like abortion. Certainly for any young ladies, or for that matter, just regardless of age, any ladies that have had to go through that type of decision, and maybe they have made that decision and have had an abortion. I don't think the responsibility on the Christian ethical side is to stand as the judge and jury and executioner for that lady. I think the Christian ethical side is to teach them some things that we discussed earlier about the nature of God. I think the Christian ethical side of things is to talk about how, yes, Christians do believe that that's wrong, and it's a terrible thing to do. But Christians also believe that all of us have been wrong, and that all of us have fallen short of the glory of God in our own ways, from Romans 3:23. And and Christians also believe that all of us weren't saved based on our works, that we weren't saved just because we're able to be so good. We're all saved by the grace of God, and that in turn motivates us to be different. And we talked about that so much in the beginning, but I wanted to bring that up again now. It seemed appropriate to me, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we continue on with some of these other ethical issues, not this week, but in the coming week. So let's knock out these videos. I think we've got about 40-ish minutes of videos that we've got to put up to finish off this week's allotted time. So we'll probably spend about 20 minutes. I really don't know what to expect again, because we don't have the discussion that we had in our on-ground class. So we'll see. We'll see how long this takes. But what I'm shooting for is about 20 minutes here on reproductive tech. And we're also going to talk a little bit about biotechnology. So maybe we can hit our quota with this. I do have a couple videos I'm thinking about adding to the playlist, but I think I spent too much time recording abortion video, or recording videos. There we go. Recording videos of myself discussing it. Those videos took longer than I thought it would. So I had some plan to put in the video, or to put in your playlist for this week, but I might take those out depending on how long our discussion runs for reproductive tech and biotech. But let's go ahead and get right into this. Okay, so reproductive technology, there's a lot of things available now for parents who are, most of this has to do with parents, or a parent who really wants to have a child, but for some reason is unable. So whether that's a single person really wants a child, and so they might go through some of these options to maybe have a surrogate mother, or maybe whatever the things might be. We'll go through this, but reproductive tech, we're talking about ways that technology can help us to have kids, and whether or not this stuff is ethical. And you're probably here at the beginning, you're like, well, yeah, like if there's a couple struggling to have a child, what on earth could possibly be the ethical issue with helping them to have a child? Well, we'll see that at the end of this, if this will click. There we go. So the first type of modern technology we want to look at here is called intrauterine insemination. We'll just call it IUI from here on out. Here's how this works. The female is inseminated with the male partner's reproductive cells. There's a better chance of getting pregnant here than with a lot of than a natural reproductive means. But there's a high chance of multiple pregnancies. Sometimes it's triplets or more, or it's pretty common to have triplets or more when a couple chooses to use IUI. There's also donor insemination. So hang on, we need to back up here. intrauterine, so it's exactly what it sounds like. So this is you don't take the egg cells out of the female and then try to fertilize them with the sperm cells. You just inject the sperm cells directly into the egg cells without removing the egg cells. So that's what the definition for what it is gives you. It's right there in the term. So then you have donor insemination, which is the same as above. So it's the same medical procedure, except it's the donor reproductive cells. So the sperm cells don't come from like the husband or the boyfriend. They come from just some other donor. So medically it's the same procedure, but it comes from someone else outside of the relationship there, which for some Christians is a big issue. And we'll get into that in a minute. In vitro fertilization, though, just means in glass. That's a Latin term that just means in glass. So it's in a petri dish. So basically, instead of intrauterine, where it's just the male cells that are harvested, and that wind up, isn't that an awful? That's a pretty weird word to use there. But intrauterine, where it's just the male cells are taken and then injected directly into the female. In vitro takes the cells out of both the male and the female, and then fertilization is attempted in a petri dish. So there you go. In glass is just in vitro. So there's two ways of doing this, though. There's the conventional method, where one or 1 to 3 of the resulting embryos are implanted. There's usually a lot. This one is usually produces several embryos. So fertilization is usually successful for many of the egg cells. But conventionally, 1 to 3 of the resulting embryos are implanted. So kind of depending on the couple. You want 1, you want 2, you want 3, what do you want? Natural, though, would be just a single egg is taken from the woman and is fertilized and then implanted. So the conventional method is to just take as many out as you can, fertilize a bunch of them, see what you get, and then implant 1 to 3 of them, depending on what the couple is comfortable with. But natural is just to take one egg and to try it one at a time. And you can probably go ahead and cut to the chase and see why here. Because if it's successful, only one embryo is formed. You don't have extra embryos. What do you do when a couple has 10 egg cells that are fertilized, but they only want one kid? Or maybe they want twins, or maybe they're willing to have triplets. Well, what about the other 7? We'll talk about that in a minute. We don't want to get too far ahead. So the other kind of section here of reproductive technology has to do with surrogacy, surrogate motherhood. There's 3 of these. There's genetic or traditional, which is where a surrogate signs a contract to be inseminated with the reproductive cells of a certain male. She'll carry the baby, she'll give birth, and then she'll turn the rights of the child over to the couple that basically, I don't want to say hired her out, but because that sounds a little crude, but for lack of a better term, I guess, she'll give the baby back over to the people who had her sign the contract to do it for them. But in most states, if she winds up deciding that she wants to keep the child that she carried for 9 months, I think she has 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. I might need to go back and crack the book on this one because it doesn't look like I wrote it down. But I'm pretty sure, and somebody listening in class, this is where it's better if we have a face-to-face discussion because odds are somebody can correct me here. But pretty sure it's she's got 24 hours, maybe it's 48 hours to decide if she wants to keep the child. But this is actually rare because of all the legal complications. So complicated to get the contract worked up. Complicated to what if she decides she wants to keep the baby. Now we got to jump through all these hoops. It's rarely done nowadays. Then you have gestational surrogacy. This is where the surrogate provides the womb but not the egg. So with the genetic one, you have something like any of these 3 methods here take place with, or really any of those, the two methods is really the big difference here between IUI and then IVF. That's the big differences. This one is just like it's just a matter of where the reproductive cells come from. But these are the two different like procedures here. So one of those two procedures will be done, but the female reproductive cells in genetic surrogacy, those belong to the surrogate. So this is, biologically speaking, the child of the donor and the surrogate mother from a biological standpoint. Certainly not like the actual things that make up motherhood and fatherhood, which is, has to do with, I guess depending on what your views of motherhood and fatherhood are, but I think traditionally the true meaning behind motherhood and fatherhood is not biological, right? It's more of, it's based on mentorship, it's based on guidance, it's based on those types of things. So when I say the biological child, I'm not trying to dismiss, and say, well, it's really their child. Well, biologically speaking, it's their child, but obviously, in this case, the child's mother biologically might be the surrogate, but for practical purposes and probably for the most deepest purposes in life, would be the mother of the particular who's in the particular couple, so not the biological mother. Gestational surrogacy, though, is where the surrogate only provides the womb. So biologically speaking, the child is the original couple's child, and the womb is just the womb is not the biological mother's womb. I know that we might be getting confused here, but the idea is you take an embryo that absolutely is the couple's. It's their sex cells that have produced the embryo. But if the embryo cannot develop or be delivered from the biological mother's womb, then a surrogate womb is used. So the surrogate is implanted with the embryo of the original couple, and then she obviously gives birth and then gives up the right of the child. Then there's altruistic. This one, he's careful. Scott Ray is careful to mention this one in the book. I don't know that this one is necessarily, it's not really a different type. It's basically just saying this one is for a friend or family member, not like jumping through hoops of contracts or using a stranger. It's pretty much just who serves as the surrogate. So, but I put this in here because it's in the book and it's probably something we all need to know. So, altruistic, though, is probably the most common. This is where like maybe a sister or a cousin or somebody like that will volunteer to be a gestational surrogate. I know of some situations that have involved genetic surrogacy, but I think most commonly what you'll see is a combination of these two right here, the gestational and the altruistic. But I don't know. See, again, this is where it'd be awesome if we were actually in person, because if any of you have experienced this, if any of you have friends or family members, or if you yourself have been involved in this type of thing, I'm not sure. So it'd be great if we were in person. You could enlighten us a little bit here. There's another type here, though. We've talked about those different methods of fertilization to begin with. We talked about surrogacy. Now we're going to talk about intracytoplasmic sperm injection. We're just going to call that ICSI. This involves injecting a single sperm cell into an egg cell. This might result in a higher incidence of miscarriages since the healthiest sperm are not always selected, though ICSI is frequently used with in vitro fertilization. So it's just the one sperm cell to fertilize the egg. So those are some of the technologies available. So say if a couple is having trouble having a child, these are the things that a couple can do in order to have a child in some way. And maybe not necessarily a couple. It might even be just an individual looking for a child. And that brings us to what does the Bible have to say about reproductive technology? Well, again, like abortion, the Bible doesn't really have anything to say directly about thou shalt not do in vitro fertilization, because obviously there is no in vitro fertilization when Scripture is written. So what do we do here? What things are relevant to our discussion on reproductive technology from the Bible? Well, first of all, we have to consider personhood again. And here's the same 2 points that we had earlier. Life begins at conception. So the unborn are actual people, not potential people. Taking innocent life of any age, race, gender is a culmination of other things that are outside of God's character. So it's murder's not okay. And I probably should be less, I should probably stress less this fact here. This is a culmination of hate and anger, because you might be saying, well, abortion is not, or abortion are here, in this case, terminated embryos. Or it's not because we hate them or because we're mad at them. It's just because we don't really want them. So I think I could probably add, and not to be insensitive here, but to add apathy or selfishness, even at worst. I'm not accusing of everyone who's done this of being selfish. I'm saying at worst that could be a motivation. So it's beyond just hate and anger here. But if personhood is at conception, then what do we do with these reproductive technologies that produce extra embryos? Well, the traditional Christian ethic would pretty obviously say that those cannot be done. So any type of reproductive tech that's going to produce an embryo that's going to wound up getting tossed in, well, I'm not going to say that, that's going to wound up being discarded. Now, they can be frozen. Embryos can be frozen, and they'll last, I think, for some time. They don't last for very long, though. So they can be preserved and maybe used later by someone who's ready for a baby. But in most cases, they're just, I'm trying to think of a way to say this that doesn't just reveal my bias, but most of the time they're discarded. Sometimes, though, they are dismembered and sold to like competing medical companies that are doing different types of research. So sometimes these extra embryos and sometimes aborted embryos are dismembered, and there's money to be made in the medical field off of those deceased embryos. So that's something I think we have to think about when we think about reproductive tech. Am I producing extra embryos? Are these a bunch of extra people who are going to be discarded and possibly dismembered and sold for a price? There are definitely things we have to think about. We do need to mention this. We can't talk about Christian reproductive or views of reproductive technology from Christianity without talking about the Catholic stance on this. The Catholic view is that sex is only intended for procreation. From Genesis 1:26 and 28, God told them to be fruitful and multiply, to go forth and fill the earth. So therefore, in the context of marriage, sex is intended for procreation, not just for pleasure. And in fact, I'm pretty sure I myself am not Catholic. So again, if you're a Catholic student in the class, please feel free to fill in some of the blanks here for us in the discussion board. But according to this, sex is only for sex and procreation both, or for a man and a woman in a marriage relationship. So this would prevent any sort of, it prevents preventative measures. So birth control, I understand it. Birth control is against the traditional Catholic view because sex is for procreation, not for recreation. So why would you ever need birth control in sex? Because you shouldn't be doing it for fun. You should be doing it to procreate. But it also doesn't allow any reproductive technology that goes outside of the scope of marriage between a husband and wife. So in this condition, or under this view, surrogacy, a traditional surrogacy would be off limits, because it's no longer the child of a man and his wife. It's the child of a man and another woman who's not his wife. Even though they're not having a sexual relationship, biologically speaking, that child is not the child of the husband and father. So the Catholic view there is very clear, or at least the traditional Catholic view there is very clear. And we won't say a ton about this here. The reason that the Catholic view is the main one that we're going to bring up here is because it's pretty much the only clearly communicated Christian ethical standard that you will find on this topic. But 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5, we will bring this up before we move on. It's not super relevant, though, because it doesn't have much to do with reproductive technology. It has to do with the role of sex in a marriage. Like, is it only for procreation, period? 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5, Paul's going to say, basically, it's good for young men to get married, or for young men and young women to get married, so that they won't fall to sexual temptation. So there's something in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5, where sex is mentioned in the context of marriage, but it's not mentioned for procreation. It's sort of mentioned for, I guess, the desires of the flesh. And there's a few other passages we could get into. And again, this is where I really wish we were in an on-campus class, because we had some really good discussion. We had a Catholic student on campus in the spring, and he wound up really leading our discussion here, and we had a great talk. So I hope if this is your background, you can give us a little bit of insight into that in the discussion boards for this week. But the point here would be that if this is your view, or you might have some views yourself that, well, a child should be, biologically speaking, if a couple's not able to have their own child through natural means, maybe they should seek adoption instead of bringing another person into their relationship, or instead of using someone else's cells for that. You might have whatever your views on that might be. This one's not quite as, I think, as clear-cut in some ways as maybe abortion was, but we certainly can at least say that all Christians would back up this ethical claim of, well, any reproductive tech that takes the life of a child, we can't be on board with that. And that's going to do it for our discussion. I told you this one was going to be quick. That's going to do it for our discussion on reproductive tech. This is not my background, so I don't have a lot of, I'm not a scientist. I haven't done a ton of studies in reproductive tech or in biotechnology. Now, I'm a little out of my depth here. So if we've got somebody in the class with this kind of background, I really hope you'll enlighten us in the discussion board. But we'll come back and talk about biotech.